Chapter 21. The Timing of the Dead Sea Scroll Find. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls did not occur in a historical vacuum. According to the official account, ancient Jewish manuscripts lay hidden and untouched for nearly 2 millennia, preserved by accident and silence, until they were fortuitously can't say that, rediscovered in 1947. This moment of rediscovery coincided not merely with the aftermath of the Second World War, but with the political, cultural, and ideological conditions that accumulated in the founding of the modern state of Israel. Such temporal proximity demands more than casual acknowledgement. It demands scrutiny. What happens when we lean into the implications of that timing? The question is no longer whether the coincidence is intriguing, but whether it is credible. Archaeological discoveries of this magnitude do not exist in abstraction. They enter the world at particular moments, are, are received by particular audiences, and are immediately shaped by the needs and assumptions of their interpreters. When a corpus of text emerged that appears to anchor modern claims in deep antiquity, especially during a period when such antiquity is politically and morally indispensable, history requires a posture of suspicion rather than celebration. Throughout the modern era, archaeology has repeatedly served purposes beyond the recovery of the past. It has been used to manufacture legitimacy, to solidify contested identities, to authorize territorial claims, and to marginalize rival historical narratives. Artifacts do not merely inform memory, they often construct it. The past, when selectively revealed and authoritatively framed, becomes a tool of persuasion as powerful as law or force. Viewed through this lens, the Dead Sea Scrolls begin to look less like a natural discovery and more like a strategic revelation. Their sudden appearance, immediate elevation, and rapid integration into a sweeping historical narrative raises questions that cannot be dismissed as cylindrical or conspiratorial. Rather, they reflect a recurring pattern. Moments of intense political need frequently produce moments of historical certainty. By the 1940s, Zionism confronted a challenge unlike any it had faced before. The moral force of the Jewish suffering after the Holocaust was undeniable, yet moral claims alone do not settle broader, secure international recognition or silence competing historical narratives. In the emerging post war order, legitimacy required more than tragedy, it required antiquity. Modern nation states are more persuasive when they can present themselves not as a new creation, but as restorations, returns to an interpreted past rather than departed. Let's try that again. Modern nation states are more persuasive when they can present themselves not as a new creation, but as restorations, returns to an interpreted past rather than departures from it. This distinction matters profoundly in Palestine. The land was already densely layered with historical claims, religious attachments, and living populations. To prevail in such a context, Zionism needed not only ethical justification, but historical depth, demonstrable, tangible evidence that Jewish life in the land was ancient, indigenous, and continuous. Political sympathy could mobilize support, antiquity could neutralize, nationalize possession. It is at precisely this junction that the Dead Sea Scrolls enter the historical stage. The texts were immediately framed as proof that Jews occupied, wrote, and preserved scripture in Judea centuries before the rise of Christianity and long before later religious divisions complicated the biblical record. They appear to show that the Hebrew Bible already existed in recognizable and stable form, embedded in the land itself. immune to Christian influence and prior to any theological dispute over its meaning or ownership. Most importantly, they seem to testify to a self contained Jewish religious world, textual ritual, and intellectual roots in Judea, and flourishing independently of later historical developments. The rhetorical value of such a corpus cannot be overstated. There were not merely These were not merely manuscripts, they functioned as witnesses. They spoke not only to religious history but to national continuity, territorial legitimacy, and cultural priority. Their very existence appeared to collapse modern claims into ancient facts, transforming political argument into historical inevitability. That this body of evidence surfaced at the exact moment such proof was most urgently required is not a minor detail, it is the central problem. Archaeology rarely delivers precisely what politics needs, precisely when it needs it. When it appears to do so, the historian must pause. There is there is the official narrative that says the scrolls represent a time right after the Maccabean War when the Jews regained their rights as a people. Then there is the view that I am promoting, and that is a view that says the scrolls represent a time when the Jews are being kicked out of the land and losing almost all resemblance of a people. That view does not fit the needed narrative to promote their right to the land. The, the familiar account of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, the wandering shepherd, the thrown stone, the shattered jar, and the sudden encounter with antiquity was not retold so often. Bleh, bleh. Let's try that again. The shattered jar and the sudden encounter with antiquity has been retold so often that it has acquired a quasi sacred status. It functions as an origin story, rehearsed with ritual consistency and rarely examined with historical rigor. Yet, when the details of this narrative are compared across tellings, they shift, timelines blur, participants change, sequences reorder themselves, and crucial moments remain frustratingly unfavorable. What remains consistent is not evidence but structure. Caves are discovered, jars appear, manuscripts surface, intermediaries enter the scene, money changes hands, and almost immediately scholars arrive with confidence not merely to describe what has been found, but to declare what it means. The speed with which uncertainty gave way to authority is striking. In genuine archaeological context, ambiguity lingers. Here it dissolves. The simplicity of the story plays a crucial role in the process. By presenting the discovery as accidental, incident, and almost folkloric, the narrative disarms skepticism. It invites beliefs rather than investigation. Like many foundational myths, it offers just enough details to feel concrete, while withholding the very documentations that would allow independent verification. The story persists, but not because it is well supported, but because it is rhetorically effective. Once recognized as mythic in function, the narrative's weakness take on a different character. Inconsistencies that would otherwise demand explanation are reinterpreted as noise around a stable core. Questions about prior knowledge of the caves, the role of local antiquity dealers, and or the sudden availability of scholars ready to authenticate and contextualize the material are quietly set aside. The story does not encourage such questions, it renders them impolite. If, however, the scrolls were already known, partially known, selectively curated, or deliberately staged for discovery, the entire pattern changes. The inconsistencies no longer appear as embarrassing flaws in an otherwise honest account, they become expected features of a managed revelation. What looks like confusion under an accidental model looks like residue under a controlled one. Perhaps more suspicious than the discovery itself is the speed with which its meaning was settled. In an unusually short span of time, scholars moved not from evidence to hypothesis, but from discovery to declaration. The Dead Sea Scrolls were pronounced unquestionably pre-Christian. They were assigned to a specific and already familiar Jewish sect, the Essenes. They were declared free to they were declared free of Christian influence, and they were said to confirm both the antiquity and textual stability of Jewish scripture. These conclusions did not emerge gradually through prolonged debate and revision. They arrived together fully formed. Such confidence is striking in any archaeological context, but especially so in one defined by fragmentary manuscripts, uncertain provenance, and complex transmission histories. In normal circumstances, discoveries of this scale generate decades of disagreement. Dates remain fluid, provenance is contested, competing models coexist. With the scrolls, however, uncertainty was resolved almost immediately, and always in the same direction. Every ambiguity seemed to lean pre Christian, every resemblance to later theology was explained away, every difficulty found a harmonizing solution. This pattern raises a methodological red flag. Scholarship does not typically converge this quickly unless guided by shared assumptions that precede the evidence. The scrolls were not simply studied, they were placed into the interpretive framework that already existed and already served clear historical and political needs. Once inside that framework, alternative possibilities were rendered unnecessary or even unthinkable. What what is most revealing is not any single conclusion, but the ambiguity of the conclusions taken together. Pre-Christian dating, Essene authorship, non-Christian theology, and textual stability all reinforce one another. Remove any one pillar and the structure weakens. Taken as a set, they function less like an independent findings and more like a mutually supporting narrative, one in which each claim depends on the others to remain credible. For decades following their discovery across the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's try that again. For decades following their discovery, across the Dead Sea Scrolls was not open to broadly collaborative. I'm not sure what else reads. Across the Dead Sea Scrolls was not open to broadly collaborative. I think I'm missing a word here. Well, we'll continue on. Instead, it was tightly restricted. A small self selecting circle of scholars controlled the manuscripts, governed their publication, and exercised disproportionate authority over questions of dating, provenance, and interpretation. Progress was slow, permissions were limited, and full transparency remained elusive long after the scrolls had already been assigned decisive historical meaning. Those who questioned the emerging framework encountered resistance. Dissenting voices were delayed, marginalized, or dismissed as speculative, ideological, or uninformed. Requests for access were denied or indefinitely postponed. Let's try that again. Requests for access were denied or indefinitely postponed. Alternative models struggled not because they had been refuted, but because they could not be fully articulated without access to the material itself. Control over the evidence translated directly into control over the narrative. This phenomenon cannot be explained away as mere academic caution or the neutral inertia of large projects. The pattern was systematic. Once the scrolls were framed as pre-Christian Jewish artifacts associated with a particular sect and insulated from Christian influence, that framing hardened into orthodoxy. It became not a hypothesis to be tested, but a conclusion to be protected. Challenges were treated not as contributions to knowledge, but as threats to stability. What was being enforced was not simply scholarly consensus, but interpretive boundaries. Certain questions were permitted, others were ruled out in advance. The cost of stepping outside those boundaries was professional isolation. Over time, this produced a feedback loop. Only those who accessed the framework were granted access, and only those with access could speak authoritatively. Consensus thus became self perpetuating. The stakes of this control extended beyond academia. The Dead Sea Scrolls had already acquired symbolic weight far exceeding their textual contents. They underwrote claims about antiquity, continuity, and cultural priority. To reopen foundational questions about their date or character was to destabilize not just a scholarly position, but a broader historical narrative. In this context, narrative enforcement was not incidental, it was essential. The identification of the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Essenes was not merely plausible, it was indispensable. Not other No other ancient group solved as many interpretive problems at once, or did so as cleanly. The Essenes occupied a narrow but strategically perfect position within the Second Temple Judaism, ancient enough to predate Christianity, Jewish enough to establish continuity, and marginal enough to absorb theological irregularities without destabilizing the larger narrative. As as an explanatory framework, the Essenes offered explanatory flexibility. Their perceived isolation explained why the scrolls diverged from later rabbinic tradition. Their continual rigor and sectarian language accounted for unusual legal and ethical emphasis. Their supposed separation from the Jewish establishment justified hostility toward the temple while preserving Jewish identity. Almost any anomaly could be accommodated under the banner of sectarian difference. Equally important was that the scenes were not what yeah. Equally important was what the Essenes were not. They were not politically active in any way that carried modern implications. They were portrayed as pacifists, withdrawn, and ultimately extinct. This rendered them safe. No living community could lay claim to the text. No modern movement could inherit their theology. The scrolls could thus be treated as relics rather than resources, objects of study rather than sources of authority. Most critically, the Essene model insulated the scrolls from Christian claims. Any parallels to the New Testament language, ethics, or eschatology could be neutralized by categorizing them as expressions of Jewish diversity rather than signs of Christian influence. Christ like theology, messianic expectation, or communal practices resembling early Christians were explained away as coincidence or shared background. Similar, Similarity no longer required explanation, it was simply assumed. In this sense, the Essenes functioned less as a historical conclusion and more as a protective container. They absorbed tension, deflected questions, and stabilized the broader narrative. Once the scrolls were placed within Essene hands, their interpretive volatility disappeared. The framework did not merely explain the data, it preserved the data from destabilizing the conclusions that had already been reached. Conspiracy does not require fabrication, it requires selection, framing, and timing. The most effective forms of propaganda rarely depend on outright forgery, although I would not rule that out. They depend on the disciplined management of truth, by choosing what to reveal, how to present it, and when to unveil it. Narratives can be constructed that feel inevitable, even when they are incomplete. In this light, the Dead Sea Scrolls need not be uniformly ancient. Yeah. In this light, the Dead Sea Scrolls need not be uniformly ancient, uniformly late, or uniformly composed later. Yeah. Did we skip a line there? Or uniformly deceptive, or to function ideologically. Even a mixed corpus, some texts generally old, others revised, others composed later, can be made to serve a single purpose if it presents if it is presented as a coherent as a coherent unified pre-Christian library. The act of unification does not work. Let's just try that again. I can't read well today. Let's go back to. Let's just read this whole paragraph. In this light, the Dead Sea Scrolls need not be uniformly ancient, uniformly late, or uniformly deceptive to function ideologically. Even a mixed corpus, some texts generally old, others revised, others composed later, can be made to serve a single purpose if it is presented as a coherent, unified pre-Christian library. The act of unification does not work. Internal diversity is blurred. Chronological layers are compressed. Competing trajectories and of transmission are collapsed into a single authoritative story. Once framed this way, complexity becomes noise rather than data. Uncertainty is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a feature to be examined. Fragmentary manuscripts are asked to carry more weight than they can bear, while interpretive caution are quietly absorbed into footnotes. What emerges is not a collection of texts inviting inquiry, but a symbol demanding assent. This is how sources become monuments. The scrolls cease to function primarily as historical witnesses and instead operate as proofs. Embedded emblems of antiquity, continuity, and legitimacy. Their value lies less in what they say than in what they are made to signify. In such a context, questioning details can be dismissed as pedantry or hostility. Because the narrative itself has already been secured, propaganda succeeds best when it tells a story people already want to believe. It does not impose itself by force, it aligns itself with exceeding desire and expectation. In the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the story of an ancient, pristine Jewish library waiting patiently to be rediscovered fit perfectly into the needs of the moment. That fit, rather than any single act of deception, is what demands historical attention. If the Dead Sea Scrolls were to be dated closer to the 2nd or 3rd century AD, the entire symbolic structure built around them would collapse. Such a shift would not represent a minor chronological adjustment, it would constitute a categorical redefinition of what the scrolls are and what they represent. Their value as pre-Christian witnesses would evaporate, and with it the narrative stability they have long provided. The scrolls would not the scrolls would then represent a time where they had no claim to the land. A later date would make the Christian influence unavoidable. Texts circulate the texts currently explained as Jewish anticipation would have to be re-examined as Jewish response. Parallels to the New Testament language, ethics, or theology could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or shared backgrounds. They would demand historical explanation within a world already shaped by Christianity. The interpretive direction would reverse. Instead of Christianity emerging from a Jewish textual world preserved at Qumran, the scrolls themselves would emerge from a landscape already transformed by Christian presence. Such a redating would also bring Jewish-Christian competition into sharper focus. The scrolls would no longer belong to a serene pre-Christian diversity, but I I can't read. The scrolls would no longer belong to a serene pre-Christian diversity, but to a contested post-temple environment in which religious identity was under negotiation and polemic was unavoidable. Texts once read as neutral expressions of sectarian Judaism would instead appear as participants in a struggle over scripture authority and meaning. In this context, the Essene explanation dissolves a marginal, isolated pre Christian sect cannot easily account for the text produced in a period defined by upheaval, redefinition, and interreligious conflict. The Essenes cease to function as a historical solution and are exposed as an interpretive convergence, useful only so long as the scrolls remain safely anchored before Christianity. This explains the intensity with which late dating theories are resisted. What is at stake is not merely chronology or even scholarly reputation, it is the collapse of a national mythology built on antiquity, continuity, and priority. To move the scrolls forward in time is to put them out of the symbolic role they have been assigned, and that, more than any technical objection, explains why such proposals are treated as intolerable. Every nation constructs origin stories. These narratives do not merely recount the past, they organize identity, justify continuity, and confer legitimacy on the present. Modern Israel is no exception. Like all states formed under conditions of rupture and contention, it has required a story that bridges catastrophe and renewal, exile and return. Within that story, the Dead Sea Scrolls have assumed a role far larger than their physical form would suggest. They have functioned as textual bedrock, material proof that the modern state is not a novel political invention, but the reemergence of an ancient and continuous presence rooted in the land itself. The scrolls appear to compress time, collapsing modern aspirations into ancient reality. They provide not merely history, but density, evidence that the past antic- anticipated the present and authorized its arrival. In this role, the scrolls are no longer ev- elevated primarily as manuscripts, subject to uncertainty, veneration, and debate. They are treated as symbols of continuity rather than rupture, or of return rather than reinvention. Their authority derives less from careful analysis and from the narrative work they perform. Once embedded in a national consciousness, their meaning stabilizes even if the texts themselves remain fragmentary and complex. This transformation has consequences. When historical artifacts become foundational myths, they are shielded from ordinary scrutiny. Questions that might otherwise be routine about dating, provenance, composition, or transmission acquire ideological weight. To question the scrolls is no longer simply to question a scholarly conclusion, it is to unsettle a story of origin that carries emotional and political force. In such a context, taboo emerges naturally, not through censorship alone, but through shared assumptions about what must be what about what must not be destabilized. The Dead Sea Scrolls, elevated from source to symbols, occupy precisely this space. They are protected not only by scholarly consensus, but by the quiet understanding that some narratives are too important to reopen once they have been closed. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls on the eve of Israel's formation presents a stark interpretive choice. Either it stands as the most extraordinary archaeological coincidence of the modern era, or it reflects a far more deliberate convergence of timing, need, and narrative construction. Whether through staged discovery, selective release, or disciplined interpretive control, the scrolls were unveiled at the precise moment they could perform the greatest cultural political work. Their appearance was swiftly framed, their meaning rapidly stabilized, and their authority carefully protected. Within a remarkably short span, they moved from obscurity to foundation, from unknown manuscripts to pillars of identity. Seen through this lens, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not merely ancient texts rediscovered from caves, they are artifacts of modern power, objects whose significance has been shaped as much by 20th century needs as by any ancient context. Their role has been limited to preserving history. It has included it it has included let's try this again. Their role has not been limited to preserving history. It has included producing it, organizing it, and policing its boundaries. This conclusion is inten- inten- oh geez. This conclusion is intentionally unsettling. It does not ask the reader to abandon respect for the past, but to recognize how often the past is curated rather than discovered. History is rarely innocent, and foundational narratives are rarely neutral. The Dead Sea Scrolls, whatever their ultimate date or origin, demand to be examined not only as manuscripts but as evidence, evidence whose meaning lies as much in their moment of revelation as in the words they contain. And I hope that's the end of that chapter. Yes, it is. We're good.